Good evening and welcome. We'll be starting our program in just under 2 minutes. Thank you. Please stand by. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our program this evening. I'm David Leonard, BPL President and host of this series, The Arc of History, Contested Perspectives. Just a little housekeeping to get us started. All of you will be muted throughout the program, but the Q&A box will be available throughout the evening. The first part of tonight's program will be conversation between our guest and myself, and we'll follow that with the second half by taking questions from you, the audience. We'll get through as many as we can, and we're looking forward to a great debate. I'm coming to you live from the Central Library at the Boston Public Library in Copley Square, here in the McKim building. We may be closed to most services today, but it's important for us to continue to offer our programs, and I'm pleased to be able to deliver this one live from the library. We look forward to welcoming everybody back in person once it is safe again to do so. Our goal with the Arc of History series, Contested Perspectives, is to pick up the issues of the day or topics and events from history, unpack them, discuss their relevance for today, and our desire for a more equal and equitable society. Now, I've been a long follower of tonight's guest, his insightful political commentary and an analysis, and we are going to drill into the topic of how progressives and moderates can unite to save the country. EJ Dionne is a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University, and visiting professor at Harvard University. He is a regular political commentator on television and radio, received his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford. In sociology, he is the author of 8 books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers. His most recent is Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country, published earlier this year by St. Martin's Press. EJ, welcome to the program.
I want to tell you it's such a joy to be with you. And as we talked before, I love the BPL. I did my first visit to the BPL was as a student when I was researching a paper on the Catholic press and Joe McCarthy. I know you had Larry Tye recently. The BPL folks were fantastic. And I also am a son of Fall River, Massachusetts. So the only prediction that I will make tonight with any certainty is Celtics in 7. We're going to come back.
Thanks for that. I'm going to move right along at this point. EJ, would you mind just telling us a little bit about your early interest in politics and how you got started in this profession?
Right. Well, as the people watching who are from Massachusetts will know, you can't be in Massachusetts, I think, for more than a few minutes without being engaged in politics. The late Mary McGrory, the great columnist Mary McGrory, who grew up in Massachusetts, once said that every baby born in Massachusetts is born with a campaign manager's gene. And I think Mary is right. And growing up in Fall River, as I did, we were a very political town. I grew up in a very political family. We violated that rule that you never talked about religion and politics at the dinner table. We talked about both all the time. And I grew up in a very politically diverse extended family. So we argued about politics all the time. And I always say that my late dad trained me to do what I did for a living because he and I loved to argue about politics. And my mom was also very engaged, was a librarian, by the way, and it's part of my great love of public libraries. Got her degree at age 70 in library science down the street at Simmons from just a little nearby. And so I always loved politics, and we used to get 4 Sunday newspapers every Sunday, and we sort of consumed newspapers as part of our love of both sports and politics. And I ended up getting connected to journalism actually through polling. A great professor friend at Harvard got hold of all the polls the New York Times had done in the 1972 election, and we thought the Times should start their own poll, and we knew just who could help them do it, and that was my first newspaper job, was involved in that. And so politics has just been in my blood. Writing has been something I always enjoyed doing, and so that's how I ended up doing this.
Do you think of yourself today as more of an academic, researcher or teacher or journalist or commentator, or a little of all of the above?
They were all very. Growing up, there were 3 things I loved. I loved politics, I loved newspapers, I loved academia. And at different times in my life, there was a different ordering. I never knew that I was going to be a journalist or write a column. And so I think of myself as a citizen out there trying to talk about politics and perhaps influence the debate. And I do think of myself as a teacher. The teaching is, I've told my students that they lift me up every day. They did today. I had a great class, actually. It's a very Boston day for me because I had a class where my friend Kathy Caveney of BC came in to talk about her great book, Prophecy Without Contempt, which is a great concept. And my students were fantastic in the discussion. So these are all part of my life, and I just feel very grateful that I am able to do these things and be part of the public debate. Sometimes make some people happy, and maybe sometimes not make some people happy, and that's okay. Again, I think argument is essential to freedom. So I don't mind, by the way, anyone out there who wants to write in a question that's dissenting, please feel free, because I actually like getting dissenting views from people because it shows we're still not completely trapped in those bubbles we are said to live in. I appreciate it when people who disagree with me cross over and at least consume what I have to say, even if they want to get mad at me.
I think your comment about rooted in politics and religion and breaking the rule about not being supposed to talk about them, and we'll get into this, I think, in talking about your book, but it's almost like we're as a society unable to have those conversations, and yet those are the very conversations that we need to be having to understand each other on different parts of the political spectrum and the values behind that.
Yeah, this moment really pains me. On the one hand, I am very much on a side. I am unreservedly on a side in this election. I'm unreservedly on broadly the progressive side of politics. I think of myself as a social democrat, essentially. And so I don't deny that. On the other hand, I grew up in an environment where, and literally inside my own extended family, where people could really disagree with great passion and love each other anyway, and continue to love each other. It's something I treasure. My cousins asked me to give the eulogy for one of my uncles, and he and I spent 35 years screaming about politics, not just talking, but screaming. And I made a point of quoting Richard Nixon in my eulogy for him, because I looked at the people in the church and I said, I thought maybe Uncle Ray would come back to life just to tell me he knew I'd be quoting Richard Nixon someday. And so it pains me that we have gotten to a point in our politics, and there are a lot of reasons for it, and there are some really fundamental things at stake in this election, but that we don't, I think, talk as much to each other. Families can't talk about politics the way they used to be able to talk about politics. And obviously, from my point of view, I lay a considerable amount of that at Donald Trump's feet. I think he has been very destructive to reason conversation in the country. But I also think there have been some deep forces in the country that have been pulling us apart. And somehow we need to defend our own positions, but hating each other to the degree that we sometimes do these days is not good for a democracy.
Yeah, we don't need to demonize each other in the process of disagreeing with what we encounter. Perhaps this is a little bit behind the title of the book. Code Red seems to be a phrase that's a big warning light going off. Can we start there and just talk a little bit about how you settled on that title and what is this moment of warning about? Even though I know the book was published in February or came out in February, and you had been working on it presumably since the 2018 election, and even so much has happened since February. But why Code Red? What's this warning about?
Well, the Code Red is, first, I have to say outright, is about what I see as the dangers of Donald Trump being reelected. And I think our sense of those dangers has only increased in recent days, where he seems willing to challenge the very possibility of throwing him out of office, saying, we'll throw out some ballots. I mean, he's challenging the very electoral process, where at least we used to be able to agree that if somebody won an election, they would take office, and that would be that. And we're not even agreeing on that. So that is part of the Code Red moment. The second meaning of it is that I do think that progressives and moderates now have a lot more in common than they realize, and that there is a need to defeat a radicalized form of conservatism that includes but goes beyond Donald Trump, so that we can return or move forward, really. It's not so much return, but move forward to a time where we can argue again about how to solve problems. And I worried early on that progressives and moderates, and when you're talking about in the Democratic Party's terms, center left and left, would spend a lot more time forming circular firing squads than realizing that they shared some significant objectives in common. And I use the word moderate, even though, as you know, David, in the book, I talk about problems with the word moderate, and you can argue about its meaning. But I also include here people who used to be Republican. Massachusetts is famous for the kind of Republican I am talking about. People like Frank Sargent back in the day, or people at Brook, who were broadly progressive in their outlook, who were also part of the Republican Party. All those people are now homeless, and they really come together within the broad Democratic coalition. Because what they agree on is that you need some public action and, yes, government action to solve certain problems. And we may disagree on exactly the path. Some people may want single-payer health care. Others may want to expand the Affordable Care Act. But what all people in that argument agree on is we have to get health insurance to everybody, Lord knows, especially after, during and after this pandemic. And so I argue there are a whole series of issues where progressives and moderates together could actually move the country forward. And I think even more now with the pandemic, we have a desperate need to come together, because we got to do an awful lot to pull us out of this mess. And this will sound very partisan, and I apologize for that, but I'm actually very fond of the Joe Biden slogan, Build Back Better. It comes really, it's not any brilliant slogan. It actually comes back from a lot of proposals that get made after crises, when neighborhoods get wiped out by hurricanes or something. And the whole idea is, at the end of a tragedy, you don't just try, at the end of a big problem, you don't just try to build back things exactly the way they were. You know that you need to move forward. And I think that's what we need to do as a country.
I mean, there's actually, if you just read the linguistic meaning of Make America Great Again and Build Back Better, there seems to be an orientation to both of those phrases that has a lot in common. Now, I think they've come to represent more than perhaps the words started out meaning, but there's an intentionality there that seems similar in both cases.
I'd say absolutely yes, but the absolutely yes is I think all Americans want their country to be great. They may define greatness a little differently, but I think most of us are in our hearts patriots. I'm talking in the city that celebrates Patriots Day, one of my favorite holidays. And we have a love of the country, and we love the freedom we have. Many of us celebrate the diversity and our immigrant history. Many of us celebrate our capacity for self-correction. We were a country that was a slave country that moved forward. We were a country of segregation, and we moved forward again. But we've also had setbacks, and that's where I see the difference in the slogans, the word again and the word better.
Right.
Because the word again implies that our greatness is behind us and needs to be recovered. Right. And the word better implies that as a country, at our best, we keep improving, or at least we try to keep improving. We perfect ourselves, in the words of the founders. So we try, not that we ever become perfect, but we strive toward being better. And so I think in some ways, that backward looking again and that better, forward looking better really do define the choice we actually face as a country.
I like your analysis much better. It's much deeper than my question suggested.
It was a great question, though.
I also think for whom in both cases is a very important dimension to look at there. This part of the conversation has taken us into looking at the terms progressive and moderate, and I think you've unpacked the moderate piece a little bit in terms of thinking of within the Democratic Party as it currently exists, center versus center left, whereas you also expanding the concept to look at the center and the middle of our country more broadly. I'd like to unpack that second part a little bit more, because I think there's a dimension of within the Democratic Party, and there's a dimension of this that applies to the nation as a whole. And that's certainly where I want to go to. I'm going to guess you're looking for the definition in the book.
Well, what I'm actually doing is there is I want to just defend the word moderate for a half sec, because I think that even if you are a person of the left, even if you are a democratic socialist, in fact, one of the core concepts of the book comes from a democratic socialist, Michael Harrington's idea of visionary gradualism, which we can talk about. Mm-hmm. I think moderation itself is a virtue that, especially after the last 3 years, we would come to have, I think, might have more respect for. I quote an academic called Aurelian Creutu, who's actually more conservative than I am politically. But he talks about moderation as a virtue that promotes social and political pluralism. It's a propensity to seek conciliation and find balance between various ideas. It rejects the idea that there is a single correct or valid way of life, on which we must all agree, and that politics often involves tough trade-offs. And I think that's true within any political ideology, and that we have to recognize that there are trade-offs we all make in all our proposals that we have to figure out. So I think moderation is a virtue independent of politics. But I use it in the book to refer to that broad group of people who could be considered the old moderate to liberal Republicans all the way through to the center-left Democrats. I think that's a big camp. And then the progressives would be people we now associate with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And the differences between moderates and progressives are partly about an analysis of capitalism and how tough your analysis of capitalism is, and how much reform the system needs. And some of it is about the depth of reform that you need in various institutions. Do we need, for example, to move all the way over to single-payer healthcare, or can we continue with a mix of public and private? After all, a lot of our healthcare is already socialized. Medicare is a socialist program. Medicaid is a socialist program. So we have a mixed system. We don't have a pure private system in our country. And when I think of myself as a progressive with a moderate disposition. My disposition has become less moderate over the last 20 years because of the radicalization of conservatism. And so I have a lot of sympathy with the goals of Warren and Sanders. I've written actually rather kindly of both of them over the years. I respect a lot of particular ideas that Warren has put on the table, including, by the way, a wealth tax, which we shouldn't think of as a radical idea. We already have a wealth tax. It's called the property tax. Mm-hmm. And the only people who pay a wealth tax are actually middle income, and the people who pay the largest share of their income in wealth taxes are middle income people, not wealthy people. So we're talking about a different extension of that tax to wealthy people. But I am also someone who thinks that in order to move forward, we often have to move in steps. And that's where the great Mike Harrington, the author of The Other America, who really turned the nation's eyes to the problems of poverty that we had forgotten back in the 1960s, talked about visionary gradualism, which is, I think, what brings together where moderates are right and where progressives are right. Moderates are right that change often comes in steps. The Social Security program, as I write in the book, was not the one that we have today. It wasn't as expansive as the one we have today. It was a big step in the right direction, but it needed a lot of reform and expansion. The Affordable Care Act is not what we need. It's a big step in the right direction. And so I think change comes in steps. But where progressives and people on the left are correct, I believe, is that reforms have to be based on a larger vision of change, that we should want to make our country in fundamental ways fairer and more equal. We want to tackle racial inequality directly. We want to tackle economic inequality directly. And so that's why I am trying in this book to say, a lot of us can sit around a table and insist on the need for change and be uncompromising about that desire, but come to terms with what each of us can bring to the table in terms of usable ideas and try to work together.
If we look at our elected officials in general in Washington and take a look at the Congress and the Senate over the last 20 years, and I think some of your colleagues at the New York Times and other places have done various analysis that the center itself has eroded completely, and there really isn't as much opportunity for bipartisanship as there was in previous groups of elected officials, and so, at least in Washington. And so, this too explains, I think, a lack of opportunity for real dialogue, meaningful compromise. And so, who are the moderates that you believe are now orphaned from the Republican Party? I think you described that certainly in terms of Massachusetts. You have people like George Will coming out and saying that he doesn't completely feel at home in the Republican Party of today. So where have those people gone?
What's happened is one of the reasons debates inside the Democratic Party can get pretty fierce is that a lot of arguments that used to happen between moderate or moderately conservative Republicans and Democrats are now happening almost entirely inside the Democratic Party. After the 2018 election, if you look at the seats that created the Democratic majority in 2018, and I write in the book, right, about two kinds of people, both of whom I find very interesting and write about as people. I write about Ayanna Pressley and her victory in Boston. Mm-hmm. I write about Abigail Spanberger, a former CIA person operative who got elected from a very conservative district in Virginia, a Democrat. And I actually wrote a column after the election saying in order to govern, for Democrats to govern, Ayanna Pressley and Abigail Spanberger have to become best friends. And very sweetly, Spanberger took a picture of the two of them at a meeting and tweeted it out with the column. And I met with a group of these new Democrats after 2018, and I looked at them and smiled, and I said, I think 25, 30 years ago, a number of you might have been liberal Republicans, and half of them rejected it out of hand because they couldn't stand the idea of being Republican these days. But the other half said, yeah, my district used to send those kind of Republicans. So I think a lot of these debates are now happening in the Democratic Party. And as you know, the book is really fierce in criticizing a radicalization of the Republican Party that started with Goldwater, continued with Reagan, but then really ramped up even more with the Gingrich Revolution and then with the Tea Party, so that all of these folks who might have reached some accommodation on solving some problems have been either defeated in elections by Democrats who say, look, we like these moderate Republicans, but we don't want Republicans controlling the Congress, or they're defeated in primaries by right-wing Republicans. Spanberger took a district where a Tea Party candidate had defeated Eric Cantor. For goodness sake, Eric Cantor is a really conservative guy, but he wasn't conservative enough for the Tea Party. And I think that says, unfortunately, people like Charlie Baker, where you are real exceptions. It seems the only, there are 3 popular governors who are Republican, and they happen to be governors of Democratic states in Massachusetts, Vermont, and my own state of Maryland here. But there's not much room for them in this party anymore.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned the 2018 election as one of the points of departure for diagnosing where we are and what could happen next, and what becomes this call for moderates and progressives to essentially unite. This is the first chapter of the book, really, and it's titled "The Power of 60 Million Votes." So I just want to offer you the opportunity to give us a few takeaways from what that meant.
Well, people might ask themselves, why is it that Joe Biden has been leading Donald Trump fairly consistently now by 6-7 points nationally, some recent polls actually by even more? What happened to Trump? Mm-hmm. Bear in mind, Trump did lose the popular vote in the last election. Right. But 2018 really was a mobilization on a scale that we hadn't seen in a long time. It was the highest turnout in a midterm election since 1914. Both sides turned out in greater numbers. But here are, I think these are really remarkable numbers. If you compared the 2018 midterm elections with the 2014 midterm elections, Republicans got 10 million more votes in 2018 than they got in 2014. Pretty good. Democrats got 25 million more votes in 2018 than they did in 2014, which explains why they had this blowout victory. And I'm talking about House races here, which is why they took over the House, even though a lot of states have been gerrymandered against them, and they overcame the barriers of the gerrymander. And I think what you saw first was a reaction against Donald Trump that mobilized people in all sorts of places, not just in Democratic strongholds. My friend Theda Skocpol, a professor at Harvard, has done some wonderful research on the ground. She first did some great research about the Tea Party and has since done some great research on the anti-Trump movement. And these were people who had never been involved in politics in a lot of very Republican places, who showed up in church basements or local diners and discovered, hey, there are more of us here than we realize. These are the people who helped defend the Affordable Care Act. And all of these Republican members of Congress who had never seen many Democrats at their town meetings suddenly had this outpouring of people saying, don't kill the ACA. And you saw those people mobilize in the 2018 election. And so district after district fell. I focus on Spanberger, on people in New Jersey, some great members of Congress, actually, Mikey Sherrill, who was in the Navy, and Tom Malinowski, who had been a human rights activist, who worked in the State Department, and so on. Now, the one last point I want to make about 2018 is in primaries, a lot of progressives like Ayanna Pressley won and like AOC won. And they too are very much part of this party. And the party itself has pulled in a more progressive direction than it would have been 20 years ago. On the other hand, the majority that Democrats got in Congress was created more by the Mikey Sherrills and the Spanbergers of the world. So in a sense, the Spanbergers needed the energy that the progressives who are represented by Presley represent. And a lot of, I've run into people who worked in Spanberger's campaign who were more progressive than her politically, but knew she was a candidate who could win in that district. But Presley and Ayanna and AOC need these moderates if they are going to form a majority. And I think that's really what the Biden campaign understood when they sort of came to a lot of agreements after the race was over with Warren and Sanders, where they sat down and cobbled out some common positions on healthcare, on education, on climate that I think might serve the country well if they actually win the election and have to govern.
Well, is that not what your book is in fact calling for? Was people like the Bidens and Sanders teams and Warren teams to actually form the type of coalition that would be uniting moderates and progressives, at least within the Democratic Party?
Bless you for that. The book, actually, I mean, I take some, when an author writes a book, you wonder, A, will anyone read it at all? B, will it have any impact at all on the way people might think about politics? And it is heartening to me that what I suggest in the book about where common ground can be found on a lot of these issues, and that it makes sense for the center left and the left to come together. A lot of these agreements they've reached are, in fact, along some of the lines that I suggest in the book. So I do find that heartening. And it's why a lot of people say, if the Democrats win, if Biden wins, Democrats will be at swords point with each other. These moderates and progressives will tear each other apart. And yeah, there'll be struggles. Of course, there'll be political struggles after this. But I think that, A, both sides understand that they are going to have to govern with the country in a very deep crisis from the pandemic and the economic problems it's caused, a very deep crisis of inequality that the pandemic has only underscored. People like me who can work on devices like the ones we're looking at right now, and people who either are out of work or have to risk their lives to work. I think all these problems have come to the fore. So I think they all realize if they don't deal with these deep problems, they're not going to get reelected, and also they will be losing an enormous opportunity. And lastly, there's a lot of talk about, when I think of this period in historical terms, the negative comparison I think of a lot are the 1850s before the Civil War, where I do worry that we are in a kind of cold Civil War, as others have said as well. Where the divisions really do run almost as deep as that, and and the issues do involve race and culture and region and religion. That's the negative side. The positive side is, I do think Joe Biden has a kind of New Deal opportunity, a New Deal opportunity, and that it may be the case that Biden's very moderation and the fact that he's a very comfortable figure to older, moderately conservative people might give him a real opportunity to create the alliance you need to begin to act on climate, act on economic inequality, act on wages, and act on making college accessible. There are a whole series of issues that I think he might have room to act on precisely because he is a comfortable figure to people who might be more reluctant to make change, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think over the years, we've heard many leading politicians talk about, the big tent approach or the rainbow coalition approach. And Obama assembled, for example, a coalition of rather diverse interests to get done what he was trying to get done. Not that his presidency isn't problematic as well. But you seem to be saying that that's what Biden has the opportunity to do here. Although that has also happened at times on the right, has it not? And then ultimately not succeeded.
Well, if you look at Republicanism past, Republicans actually, in our history, accomplished quite a number of things, from all the way back to Lincoln with the Morrill Act that created land-grant colleges, and the Homestead Act, and Teddy Roosevelt and the national parks, and Eisenhower with the interstate highways and the federal student loan program that, by the way, helped me go to college. Thank you, Ike, and a Democratic Congress that passed that. I think that the Republican Party's vision has narrowed radically where if you looked at what the Republicans were trying to do in Congress, they were trying to kill Obamacare. They were trying to cut taxes. The main policy achievements of the Trump administration are a broad tax cut for corporations, massive deregulation, rather, from my point of view, I'm sorry to say, rather morally hideous approaches to immigration and refugees, and not a whole lot else. And, you know, I see this, Louise Richardson, another Boston hero, another a historian I want to say at BU, forgive me if I'm getting it wrong, you know, has written about that old Republican Party that has done some extraordinary things, but that party doesn't exist anymore. And I think it's a sad thing. And I think only the defeat of this radical form of conservatism can allow a better form of conservatism to emerge.
There are, if I could, and you refer to this in the introduction and then pick this up in 4 of the core chapters of the book. You say there are 4 issues that have been particularly vexing to progressives and moderates alike. And I'm actually reading from page 16. It's the structure of the economy, the renewed political power of identity, the rise of nationalism, and the United States' role in the world. We could talk about any of those 4 for an entire session. But it strikes me that those are not just the issues that the left has to work out. I think they're equally as vexing, perhaps in a different way, for the right. And so why are these the 4 things that we're struggling with as a political country?
First, correction. I was thinking of another wonderful Richardson. Heather Cox Richardson is the author of a great book on the Republican Party that I'm sure is on your shelves, called To Make Men Free. And Heather, I'm sorry I had another Richardson in my head when I quoted you, but anyway.
We appreciate live fact checking. That's all.
Yeah, live is very important. It's it's one of the benefits of technology, and also just keeping your book and having a good index next to you. You're right. These are issues that, in fact, help explain why Trump got elected in the first place, at least why he won the Electoral College in the first place. I make the point, for example, on foreign policy that we need to rethink where we were, and Trump's victory ought to remind us that for an awful lot of Americans, the old-fashioned foreign policy elite was not perceived at all as caring about their interests. I suggest that there's a lot to be said for the old internationalism, and that the United States does need allies in the world, and wrecking NATO is a very bad idea and not in our interests. And in that sense, I too am a kind of traditional internationalist. But I argue in the book that an awful lot of people in places like Fall River, where I grew up, or Lynn, or Lowell, or Flint, Michigan, or Erie, Pennsylvania, looked at what happened to the economy, looked at what happened as a result of trade deals and economic change, and said, these foreign policy elites aren't thinking at all about me when they're making policy. And this is another area where I think sort of the internationalism that candidates like Biden and Pete Buttigieg and I think to a large degree Kamala Harris supported needed the correction of a foreign policy put forward by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders that said, these elites have to start thinking about American foreign policy, not only in terms of our security interests, and not only, by the way, in terms of the climate, which obviously is a national security issue, but also how our policies can serve the economic well-being of all Americans. And I argue that Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt were able to build a consensus behind an internationalist foreign policy because Americans in their gut believe that Truman and Roosevelt had their economic interests at heart. So that's one area where I think we need rethinking. The other I'll mention is, this whole question of identity and class. And there's an argument that often happens among Democrats, we need to focus on class politics and forget about identity, or we need to focus on racism and sexism and forget about the white working class. I say no, either yes to both or no to both, depending on, I'll say it in the positive sense. You have to worry about the inequalities created by identity, and you have to worry about the inequalities created by class. African Americans have very particular grievances going back deep in our history and problems created by an embedded racism that we simply have to confront as a country. They are aggravated by class inequalities, but they are also separate from class inequalities. On the other hand, working class people of all races, white as well as Black and Latino, have legitimate complaints about inequalities that have grown for 40 years, and that we must simultaneously deal with, I quote a great political scientist, Nancy Fraser, we have to deal with the issues related to recognition, meaning race and sexism and LGBTQ issues, but we also have to deal with the issues related to distribution and redistribution. And so I want, one of the reasons, there's a quote from Bobby Kennedy at the beginning of the book, and one of the reasons I continue to revere Bobby Kennedy is he was someone who had the ability to inspire trust among white working class people and African Americans, many of whom, by the way, are working class. He could talk across these lines. And I think we need a politics that can cut across and talk across these lines to bring us together.
Mm-hmm. I do want to pick up one of the third of those, which is the structure of the economy. When we were talking earlier today before the session, I think you got into saying that, well, we're in a somewhat of a socialized approach to the economy anyway, given how we've dealt with the 2008 financial crisis and the other crises that went along with it, given how we're having to deal with the pandemic and its economic impacts, even if some aspects of the spectrum are holding their nose in order to pass trillions of dollars of relief. So the argument, I think, in the book is about what form of regulation on capitalism versus unfettered capitalism is the right balance. And this is the thing that's vexing about this topic to progressives and to moderates as they engage with their colleagues across the spectrum.
Right. Now, this is very tricky. I want to say you are sitting right now in a great socialist institution, and I don't want any of your conservative donors to give you any less money because of that. But the slogan, I love the slogan of the library, free for all. And the library itself says, this is a service that we will offer to everyone for free. Public schools are essentially socialist institutions. Public water systems are essentially socialist institutions. Another great Bostonian, Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, loves to make his socialism speech along these lines, but it's true. We live in a mixed economy. We do have a market. We do have a lot of private initiative. Most people, the reason I call myself a social democrat and not a democratic socialist, is simply to recognize the fact that most democratic socialists accept that a market is going to be part of our economy and that it's not a market as such that's the problem. The question is, what kind of markets do we want to build? What will be in the market? What do we want to be bought and sold, and what don't we want to have bought and sold? And it's how you regulate the market, that markets can be lightly regulated and produce more pollution, or more heavily regulated and produce less pollution. Markets can be regulated to break up monopolies, or we can allow the growth of monopolies, so that we face real choices. And that's why when Elizabeth Warren said, I'm a capitalist, and her critics said that she's not really a capitalist. No, she really is a capitalist. She believes deeply in markets. But we have a lot of debating to do and some decisions to make about what are we going to do about the rise of, for example, very large tech companies. I did an event earlier this week with Zephyr Teachout, wonderful name, who has a book about monopoly. And we had a long conversation where she believes this is an age like the era of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, where we really need to start dealing with the question of concentrated economic power again. But bottom line, I think the whole country moved left after 2008, whether they admitted it or not. Because after the economic collapse of 2008, lots of people had to admit that an underregulated financial market could be a disaster for everybody, including capitalists themselves. And it took us years to dig out from the damage that was done by what I think can fairly be called an unregulated market. Again, it doesn't mean capitalism is bad, but it means capitalism can have manifestations that are destructive. And it's a funny thing, but it's often people the capitalists attack as socialists who save capitalism every single time. People who hated FDR as a socialist, well, FDR wasn't a socialist, and he helped save capitalism. Barack Obama was called a socialist. He wasn't a socialist, and I think he helped save capitalism. And I think that, someday maybe we won't have to argue about that anymore, but it seems that every cycle, that's what happens to us. That socialists...
and there is clearly a demonizing of the socialist term being thrown around in the current discourse as a way to, I think, attack some of the policies that you're calling for to make everybody's lives better.
I quote in the book, I was trying to find it, but I won't find it fast enough. Someone who worked in FDR's administration said, we socialists are actually trying to save capitalism, and the capitalists don't want to let us do it, And anyway, I am hoping that we'll find our way out of this morass.
I'm going to start taking audience questions in a second, but I did want to finish my segment of questions by talking about the conclusion of the book and ask you to expand on two concepts. The one of why change can't wait, why have we reached the precipice right now? And secondly, you're calling for essentially a coalition, a bringing together of all Americans for the betterment of the country.
Right. Now, I must say that I honor Presley for that, because I loved her slogan when she ran for Congress, "Change can't wait." Because I love the slogan because it seemed to me to bring together Barack Obama's change we can believe in with Martin Luther King's the fierce urgency of now. And I think that this was written before the pandemic. If you didn't think if you thought change could wait before, I don't see how you can possibly think change can wait now. And it is for the whole country. A lot of programs to lift up the parts of the country that are hurting the most are not just in the interests of those parts of the country, they are in the interests of the country as a whole. If we have large numbers of Americans who are completely isolated by this economy, who get stranded by this economy, we are wasting enormous amounts of talent and work it's in the interest of all of us to lift them up. When you think about the GI Bill, which is one of my favorite, but despite its shortcomings, one of my favorite pieces of legislation, GI Bill let a whole generation of people get higher education, in some cases start their own businesses, in many cases buy a home. All that investment in those people was really good for them, but it was incredibly good for the economy. It helped create this large middle class that made the entire economy grow. And I am, to oversimplify my own view, I am broadly of the view that a more equal society is actually in the interests of everyone, including the rich, because a more equal society will produce more wealth, consume more wealth, and that if you have income concentrated in a smaller number of people, we saw what happened when that happened. It was called the Great Depression. And we haven't hit the levels of inequality. The last time we hit the levels of inequality we've been at recently was 1929. It's a bad idea not to spread the wealth around, to use a term that was much criticized when Barack Obama said it. But I think it's a good capitalist principle that we are all better off when wealth is widely dispersed. That is what the founders of our republic believed. They believed that a free country depended on the wide dispersion of wealth, and that's what we need again.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take up one of the questions that I see here on the chat, and I'm going to break one of the rules that we were talking about early in our opening segment about not mixing religion and politics. Although that's a rule that I think you're up for breaking. And I think it's important because we certainly, while there are plenty of religious people on the left, I think there are an alignment of religious issues on the right. So the question is, do you think any progressive or moderates understand real evil? And do you think the progressive and moderate movement can change the conversation about religion in our society? So I'm wondering if this is really about, do we need to have religion and politics in the same conversation to really understand true values? Or should we try and keep them completely separate?
If there weren't a pandemic, I think I'd want to have a drink with that person. I love that question. So thank you very much. Particularly, you're using the word evil. One of my heroes is Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian, the great liberal theologian. But it's always said that Niebuhr taught liberals about original sin. And Niebuhr is quoted as saying, although he acknowledged getting the line from someone else, original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church, by which he meant that the one thing we see every day is that human beings are flawed. They commit sin, they hurt each other, they do dumb things, they sometimes do bad things. And so I do think it's important, if you are a liberal, to understand that evil exists, and I think liberals instinctively get that. I mean, we condemn evil all the time. We condemn evils of racism and sexism and economic oppression. But I think that it's important to understand that human beings have the ability to improve, but that sin exists too. I think I like Niebuhr because he calls on us to believe in both sin and salvation. I think religion is a particularly vexed problem now in politics because you have had the rise over the last 20 years of an extraordinary number of Americans who have left religion altogether, what are called the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not like the nuns, N-U-N-S, that taught me in grade school. Among young people, up to 40% tell pollsters that they don't identify with any religious tradition. This has created an enormous coalition management problem among progressives, because progressives include some of the most religious people in the country, particularly African Americans, and the least religious people in the country. The Republican Party has an easier coalition management problem on this because more than 2/3 of the party are white Christians of one kind or another. The problem on the progressive side is a lot of the religious right, and I'm a Catholic, and within the Catholic Church, very conservative voices have become so dominant that an awful lot of progressives, particularly young progressives, associate religion itself with right-wing politics, which has led them to flee. I think it's very important for religion, and particularly Christians and Catholics like I am. I think it's important for church leaders to understand that if all of these young people think the only point of religion is to oppose gay marriage, for example, same-sex marriage, an awful lot of young people are going out the door. And what they are doing is downplaying an extraordinary social justice tradition that is part of Catholicism, that is so much part of American Protestantism through people like Niebuhr and the social gospel movement and the African American church. And I think that this election, Biden is talking about religion in a more explicit way than Hillary Clinton did. And I think one of the tragedies of the Clinton campaign is she is a genuinely religious person. Her Methodism was central to her politics. She talks about it in a powerful way. I think the campaign downplayed it because they were worried about turning off that part of the progressive coalition that was somewhat uneasy with her anyway, some of the Bernie supporters and others. And I wish she had talked about it more. I think Biden, if you looked at the Democratic convention this time, they were more explicit, I think, in lifting up religion and saying Joe Biden is a religious person in this social Catholic tradition. And I think we desperately need a new religious conversation in the country. I have a longish piece coming out in about 2 weeks or so, or maybe a week, in a magazine called Commonweal, the liberal Catholic magazine. So I hope this person can look at it and send me an email and tell me if you think I'm all wrong in what I argue in that piece. But thank you for the question.
John, thank you for the question indeed. There is I guess the word evil is popular in our questions tonight, but in this next one, it's being used in an entirely different way. Christine asks, why can't our two-party plus system, we can talk about that, why can't they nominate candidates that we can rally behind as a country, because they'll move our country forward, as opposed to firebrands that force us to choose between lesser of two evils, Trump and Hillary, Bush and Gore, and so forth. There's a little characterization to that we may want to unpack, but I think I take the point. There's, I wanted to hear your thoughts on the two-party system, as well as the core of the question, which talks about the type of candidates that come out of the primary process.
My favorite commentary on lesser evils politics was from former Congressman Barney Frank, who actually represented part of my hometown of Fall River. And Barney wrote a great piece once where he said, the only candidate I ever voted for unreservedly was myself the first time I ran. And he said, when I ran for re-election, I looked at my record and I could see there were probably some mistakes I made and some things I could have done better. But I thought about it, and on balance, looking at my opponent, I decided to vote for myself one more time. And so I think that so much of lesser evils politics is in the eye of the beholder. That just think of people who voted in the Democratic primary. Yeah, for Bernie and Elizabeth Warren supporters, Joe Biden might be the lesser of two evils in this election. But if Bernie or Warren had won, for people who voted for Biden or Mayor Pete or someone else, they might have been the lesser of two evils. So that in a broad coalition party, you will necessarily have candidates who can pull together people adequately but are not perfect. And it's rare, it's rare that politicians in their own lifetimes are seen as, even great ones, are seen as being as great as they are later. Walter Lippmann said of FDR that he had a first-class temperament and a second-class mind. We see FDR as a great man, but there are a lot of people who had their doubts about FDR in 1932. So I guess I think we take our candidates like we take human beings in general as they come. In my lifetime, I voted with way more enthusiasm for some candidates than for others. But I do like the Joe Biden line that, when you decide on the election, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And I think that's what we face fairly consistently. On the two parties, really briefly, there's a strong case for a two-party system, a strong case for a multi-party system. The advantage of a multi-party system is that it's really quite good at representation. So if you're, kind of a middle-of-the-road person on a bunch of issues, you can vote for that party. If you are a democratic socialist, you can vote for that party. If you're a green, you can vote for that party. If you're a libertarian, they all get some seats in parliament. And so you feel represented by some group of people. That's a good thing. Problem with the multi-party system is that all those parties have to figure out how to create a coalition government at the end. There's got to be some majority to govern the country. When it works out well in a way that you like those coalitions, then you say, yeah, I'm represented within this coalition. The disadvantage of the two-party system is you don't know what the coalition is going to look like before the election. You just vote for your party and the politicians run it. And in Italy, for example, where I was lucky enough to be a correspondent, that led to essentially the same government for about 30 years, with dominated by one big party, the Christian Democrats, with different partners coming in. And the Italians used to complain of what they called, the Italians are great at inventing words, partitocrazia, a partyocracy. And the disadvantage of a two-party system is we're all in this big blob together, and you and I might be at opposite ends of the thing. The advantage is you know what coalition you're electing. You know that when you elect Joe Biden, you're going to be electing a party that includes people that run from Mark Warner on the more conservative side to Bernie Sanders on the other side. And those are the people going to be running the country. And it's easier to throw the bums out in a two-party system. So I like the representational aspect of multi-party systems, but I really like the responsiveness of the two-party system. Anyway, that's a political science-y lecture, but you asked.
Well, as we've gotten into the notion of, or the concept of full representation, there's now debate about ranked choice or.
I am very much for ranked choice. To me, is the halfway house between the two. I am a fan of ranked choice voting because it allows people who really want to vote third party to express themselves and sometimes win, by the way, and have at least some chance of getting representation. But it also allows them to be part of the governing majority eventually. So, just take ideal types. You're a Green and you really want to vote Green 1, but you prefer the Democrat to the Republican, so you give the Democrat a 2. You're a libertarian, you probably, maybe not Trump, but in some other circumstances, you prefer the Republicans second. So you give the libertarians a vote, but you give the Republicans a second vote. I think it's a good system. It's working in Maine. Cambridge, Massachusetts had it forever. It takes a long time to count the ballots, but that's all right. It takes longer to count the ballots. Australia uses it. Ireland uses it. I think it's a very fair system, and it saves you a lot of trouble because you don't get the party you hate by voting for the party you like best, and that's a good thing.
Well, let's throw the one other dimension to this onto the table as well, and that's the Electoral College. Again, which there is much debate about whether it is truly representative. It is what our Constitution or what our democracy calls for, but it certainly protects the smaller states in terms of representation, but does it work for the 21st century?
I think the Electoral College is a national catastrophe, and that we will be facing really difficult legitimacy problems going forward. We cannot say that we are a democratic or a republic or a democracy, whichever term you prefer, and consistently have elections where the loser of the winner of the popular vote does not become president. And this has happened twice since 2000, and there's a reason why it's happening more often, which is that more and more of us are squeezing in a smaller and smaller number of states. It's related in the same way I don't like the United States Senate, which is very hard to change under the Constitution. By 2040, 70% of us will live in 15 states, which means that 70% of the country will have 30 senators out of 100. That is terrible. That is a real crisis waiting to happen. And that obviously also means that the smaller, more rural states will have even more sway in picking our president. The Electoral College underrepresents Latinos as well. It underrepresents African Americans. It overrepresents rural areas. Wonder why we have such generous farm policies and not so generous urban policies in our country. So I think it's a terrible system. And that we need to change it. It's going to be very hard. The case for the small states to be for it is right now, if you are, forgive our dog Casey, who is barking at someone in the street, but there are probably some dog lovers out there. The reason some small state people might like it is if you live in Utah or Vermont, the candidate is never going to pay attention to you because people know that Vermont's going to go Democratic and Utah is going to go Republican. There are a whole lot of states that just are never part of the campaign, and you really don't choose the president in the end. I'm going to vote in Maryland, but Joe Biden never lost Maryland. He's losing everything. Similarly, you in Massachusetts, however you vote, you know that Joe Biden is going to carry Massachusetts. So I think there's an interstate compact floating around state legislatures representing about 190, last I checked, electors have passed laws pledging their electors to the winner of the popular vote if a majority of states states representing a majority of the electoral college ever get there. I'm glad Maryland's part of that compact. I would like to see that happen because I think we should elect the president by the popular vote. And by the way, ranked choice voting would help that because people say, aha, you could get a minority president that way. Not with ranked choice voting. So if you got rid of the electoral college with ranked choice voting, you would get a majority president.
Another recipe for the possible rescue of democracy.
I do believe that, yes. Thank you for putting it that way.
Judith's question takes us one step further. She asks, how do we get beyond the concentration of political power in corporate hands that was created by the Citizens United decision?
Nope, that's too much light. My light is odd in the house here.
Okay, we can take a second.
I guess I'll take the darker. Light. I was born with a face made for radio anyway. Corporate power is a huge problem. Citizens United is a huge problem. One of the reasons I, like many of you probably, are agitated by this court fight and the prospect of a 6-3 majority, conservative majority on the court seized by conservatives, I think illegitimately in the first instance with Merrick Garland and now by ramming this through before the election, are two decisions that I think were direct attacks on democracy. One was Citizens United, which got rid of laws. We had a long history of saying, yes, people are free to make donations, but money shouldn't dominate politics. Heck, in the Jacksonian era, people talked about the money power in politics and the dangers of money. And we had restrictions. McCain and Feingold, Republican and Democrat, agreed that we should put some restraints on money in politics. Citizens United wiped that out to a large degree and has created this free-for-all. The other decision that was horrific, I think, was the Shelby County decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act. And I saw that as an attack on democracy from two sides, one enabling elites and the other disempowering the previously excluded by gutting the Voting Rights Act, particularly African Americans, Black Americans. I think that one way to do it is to I am in favor of forms of campaign finance where you give a lot of matching funds to smaller contributions, where you create systems where the first $100 that you or I give are matched 7 times by a campaign fund, so that candidates can rely on small donors. I think the good news about politics right now is small donors are making themselves felt. Bernie, McCain really started it. Howard Dean pushed it forward. Barack Obama pushed it forward. Bernie took several steps. Now a lot of Biden's money and even a chunk of Trump's money comes from small donors. I think if we created a system that matched small donations, it's part of H.R. 1, that reform bill in the House. And then I think we need some various reforms to lobbying and people in and out, how congressmen go in and out of government, how congressmen leave Congress and become lobbyists. I think there are a lot of things we can do to lobbying, but I think it's the campaign money system needs to be fixed, because I just don't want politicians spending as much time as they do around very, very wealthy people. Not that there's anything wrong with wealthy people as people, but it distorts your vision of what the country looks like if you spend all your time in very, very big houses and not enough time in smaller houses.
We have one more question in queue. I'll just offer people the opportunity to add additional questions. And otherwise, I'll put this one to our guest. In the meantime, if you are looking for a copy of EJ Dionne's book, Code Red, or any of his other works, please check them out from the Boston Public Library, your local library, or your local independent bookstore. In our case, we're partnered with Porter Square Bookstore in Cambridge for tonight's program. EJ.
Thank you, Porter Square Bookstore.
Yes. EJ, the question from Phil is about Donald Trump, because I think we can't look only at the left and the center that we're talking about. The question was really trying to get at why so many people across the country have chosen to support Donald Trump. And the question is, can you please psychoanalyze how so many people support him in spite of or because of all that he says and does?
It is a great question, and I think that question is discussed in a lot of households right now. In the first instance, I think we need to understand how partisan we have become and how divided by party we have become. And in the 2016 election, Donald Trump got 90% of the vote from people who call themselves Republican and 80% of the vote from people who call themselves conservative. So I think that's piece one of it. Piece two of it is there were a lot of angry people in the country who felt disempowered, disinherited really by our economy. And it's not the places with the highest unemployment that voted for Trump, but they tended to be the places that had suffered steep declines or the greatest challenge from trade or technological change. Think Erie or parts of Michigan or parts of Ohio, or even in Massachusetts, some of our mill towns where they voted Democratic, again, because we're loyal Democrats in Massachusetts. But Trump ran ahead of Mitt Romney 4 years earlier in a lot of the factory towns in Massachusetts. And I think some of it was just an expression of frustration over that. And then I think it's undeniable that you can express this in ways that are more charitable or less charitable. And sometimes there are ways in which we should try to hold to the more charitable explanation, but the less charitable explanation may have a lot of truth to it. A more charitable explanation is there are a lot of people who don't like the degree of change in the country, and they are religious traditionalists who are uncomfortable with gay marriage, but they are also people who don't like the changing ethnic makeup of the country. They don't like how much immigration there has been. And bear in mind that we were 4% foreign born, 4.7% foreign born in 1970, and about 13, 14% now. So it's almost like the change we went through in the 1910s when there was also a backlash against immigration. And then there's pure racism. And it is undeniable that race also motivates some Trump voters. I always liked the formulation of a black writer called Charles Gaba, who said, not all voters who voted for Donald Trump are racist, but for all Trump voters, his racism was not a deal breaker. And I think for a lot of people, obviously, especially for Black Americans, but for a lot of us, the rest of us, it is disturbing that many Americans would vote for a man who would say the things Donald Trump says and do the things, for example, to immigrants that Donald Trump does. And that's why I always say I resigned from the prognosticators union at midnight on election night in 2016. But it's why the numbers right now point to his losing. I am really struck by the fact that in the 2018 elections, 10 to 15% of Trump voters switched to Democratic candidates for governor in the Senate in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin. I think there are Trump voters who wanted change but didn't vote for this, and we'll see. I guess I am fundamentally wrong in my view of our country if Donald Trump is reelected. I just will put it that way. I really believe that there is a majority in the country that, for whatever reason, some of them, a majority of Americans who want to say no to this, including some people who voted for Donald Trump in the last election. And we'll find out if I'm wrong. I've been wrong before, but I pray I'm not wrong, because I really worry about, I'm less worried about being wrong than I am about the consequences that follow if I am wrong.
Right. Appreciate that. We did get one more question, and this has come up, I think, both in the context of the potential of a Supreme Court nomination in the next 40 days and the rules changes around the filibuster. The question is, should the Democrats remove the filibuster if they take back the Senate in order to advance a Biden administration agenda, in order to, I guess, avoid a repeat of the beginning of the Obama administration, where things got held up that could have moved forward for better or worse?
So I have my own very particular idea about the filibuster, which will never, ever pass, but I'll say it anyway.
Do tell us what that is.
If there is any value, the problem with the Senate is that 51 senators can represent as few as 18, 19, 20% of Americans. So that a minority, senators representing a tiny minority, can, with 51 votes, impose their will on the vast majority. Now, fortunately, it's harder than that, because Vermont's a small state and Idaho's a small state, and I doubt they'll ever send the same kind of senators to Washington. Nonetheless, you've seen it in these confirmations where 51 senators who will vote, or 50, if it's 51 senators vote to confirm Trump's appointee, they will represent a minority of the country when you do the math. So if I could do it, I would like to say that senators representing 51% of the country have the ability to block action. Therefore, you would try to get rid of some of the anti-majoritarian aspects of the Senate, so that if senators, representing California and New York and Texas and, and so on, created a block, they could block action. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but I want to throw it out there for anybody. That's the only filibuster I can justify as being democratic. I think that would actually enhance democracy. Having said that, I think at this point there's no alternative but to get rid of the filibuster, and I'd rather take my chances and get rid of the filibuster, have the opportunity to achieve some major change. And I think it becomes incumbent on the Democrats to organize themselves again in places like North Dakota and South Dakota, which recently had 4 Democratic senators. So each of them had 2 Democratic senators. In Montana, which may elect a Democratic senator this year. I think that Democrats are just going to have to break through in some of those states, because unfortunately we're going to be stuck with the Senate for a while. I'm all for letting DC in as a state. I'm all for doing things to try to make the Senate less unrepresentative. But in the short term, I think progressives are just going to have to start organizing those states. And maybe the pandemic is going to have a lot of people moving to those places. I hear Boise, Idaho is thriving, and a lot of liberals are moving into Boise, and they have a Democratic mayor. So who knows?
Makes social distancing a little easier, it seems.
Yeah. So who knows what will happen to Idaho in 20 years? But anyway, I would. So my short answer is, even though I have some doubts, I'd get rid of the filibuster, because I think we've just got to take action. We're pretty bold action if the Democrats actually take power. And just getting stuck will only create even more alienation in the country.
Great. Well, just to wrap up, are you working on something else as your next work yet, or?
Well, a couple of things actually that I'm working on. I am a colleague and I worked on a project. A working group on what we have called universal civic duty voting. We believe that America should adopt the Australian system of requiring everybody to vote. We do that in part because we want to tear down all the barriers to voting. We want to have automatic voter registration, easy voting. We think it's the best way to push back on voter suppression, and it's led to some quite positive consequences in Australia. Miles Rappaport is my colleague over at Harvard, and he and I are, I think, going to write a book on this. So that's one project. And then the other
public
project,
holiday as well for voting, or
I'm
not
sorry?
necessarily a public holiday as well?
Yeah, we could do that. We want to. The holiday is actually interestingly controversial among voting rights advocates. I'm sympathetic to a public holiday. I like the Italian system where you vote on Sunday or Monday morning. So for people who are away on the weekend can catch up on Monday morning. But also automatic voter registration, many more polling places, easier mail voting, all kinds of things. We want to make it as easy as possible for people to cast ballots. The other project I'm working on is with my friend Melissa Rogers, who was the head of the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships in the second Obama term. And we are writing a report about how we think the next president should deal with religion and issues related to religion in public life, including faith-based partnerships with government and social service areas, in foreign policy. We have a lot of suggestions. What we're looking for is protecting First Amendment rights, protecting religious freedom, and protecting and trying to reduce the polarization in the country around religious issues. We want to fight those who would sort of violate traditional lines between church and state, but we also want to fight against the idea that religion itself is something that should be seen as inimical to small d democratic government, which I don't believe it is. So anyway, it's a project that we're going to put out a report in a few weeks, actually. And so those are the two big projects I'm working on now. Thanks for asking. More than you wanted to know.
That's great, as well as the upcoming piece in Commonweal magazine. So that should be great things to keep an eye out for. And maybe we should keep an eye out for you on election night or election week, as I guess we'll have for sure too.
Excellent. I just want to thank you for a really wonderful. This is one of the best conversations I've had on the book. I've had a lot of good ones. I'm not complaining about any of the others. This was just a really lovely conversation. And again, it's been a real honor when I heard that the BPL wanted me to do this. I'm really grateful because you are such an important institution in that city and in the whole metro area. And so I'm very grateful to have been able to be here.
Well, thanks again so much for joining us tonight. Good luck with the book. And I just want to do shout outs to our great staff who helped coordinate things tonight, Kristen, Amanda, and Jay. And if we can go to the closing slide, we can see some upcoming conversations. The next one of which is next Tuesday with Barbara Berenson, where we're continuing to focus a little bit on women's rights and the women's suffrage movement. That will be followed on October 13th by looking at Thomas Schwartz's book on Henry Kissinger and American Power, again, continuing to take a look at our leading political figures. And thirdly, a fascinating work by Daniel Immerwahr on How to Hide an Empire, a history of the great United States, and that is in conjunction with the Leventhal Map Center here at the Boston Public Library. So 3 great conversations coming up. Please join us for any of those. And without further ado, just a reminder to please fill out your Census 2020 forms if you have not already. There's a day or 2 left unless the date is extended. And also, please register to vote and please plan your vote. EJ, once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We'll see you next time. Please be well.